Hi, I'm Shane.
And I'm Alex.
And this is the RPM Podcast.
Thanks very much for joining us again for the RPM Podcast. This time for the Mexican Grand Prix, or the Mexico Grand Prix, which it has rather curiously been called. Shane and I were discussing how it's rather unusual that some races are used. I'm not quite sure what the word for it is. Is it demonym? Anyway, there's a word for it where you describe something as like being of a particular nationality. British, Dutch, whatever it is, right? And some races are Mexican. You'd expect it would be the Mexican Grand Prix, but it wasn't. It was called the Mexico Grand Prix. And that happens with other races too, which I thought was curious. But my random musings about the way that we describe the race aside, we're here to talk about the 71 laps, wasn't it, of the Mexico City track. And you forget that it's quite a short lap. But we did see an absolutely dominant performance from Max Verstappen, who now has quite a significant lead in the championship. The constructors now down to 1 point. It's all starting to swing towards Verstappen and Red Bull, isn't it? So the momentum is behind them after the result today. We're here to chat about everything that happened from that to the midfield and all the action. So Shane, get us started.
Right, first things first, let's dive straight into qualifying. That's how excited I am about this qualifying session. Pretty much your standard top 10 for qualifying, with the surprise appearance from Yuki, which we'll talk about in a second, and his qualifying session. The real surprise that was Mercedes managed to out-qualify the Red Bull by almost 4 tenths. Now, going into this weekend, we weren't expecting Mercedes to be on top of the timing sheets for qualifying at all. All through the practice sessions, they really, apart from Bottas in one of the sessions, I think, topped it. But it was a real Red Bull-dominated weekend. It all started to look like Red Bull was going to dominate this whole weekend. And then Mercedes somehow managed to top both the timing sheets. So Bottas in P2 and Bottas in P1 and Lewis Hamilton in P2. Not many of us were expecting that. Aside from that, a lot of drivers took penalties this week. This was the week for 4 or 5 drivers to take grid penalties due to engine replacement or requesting additional parts, etc. Alex, before we talk about Yuki and the whole qualifying situation surrounding him, have you got much to add on the qualifying order itself?
Only that when I saw I was pretty relieved in a way to see both McLarens get into Q3 because I was a bit worried both of them wouldn't make it. It did seem to be a track that they were struggling on. I think maybe it's to do with the thin air and something to do with the aero nature of the McLaren, but it really didn't suit them, and I was kind of relieved that they weren't both out in Q2 or something like that. But that signalled the start of what was to be a significant struggle and advantage Ferrari. And overall, there wasn't any big surprises, like you say, lots of penalties being taken, which made sense. Stroll did cause a red flag by binning it, didn't he? Of quite an unusual place to lose it, really. I know Bottas did crash there 2 years ago. It feels like quite an unusual place to lose it. I can only assume it's because of how dusty the track was. So that was a slightly unusual incident. But otherwise, the big talking point was really about what happened with Tsunoda, or rather, what didn't really happen with Tsunoda, but that he was exactly rather roundly blamed for some reason. Do you want to get us started on that?
So should we talk about why Yuki was in Q3? Because there's no disrespect to the young guy himself. He hasn't really made many Q3 appearances this year, and Mexico wasn't one of these places where we really expected him to make that Q3 appearance. But during Q2, AlphaTauri made a decision for him to use soft tyres, whereas everyone else, pretty much the whole field qualified on medium tyres in Q2 because that's what they wanted to start the race on, apart from Yuki and some other chap at the back of the grid who started on softs. I can't remember for the life of me what driver it was. But there was only 2 drivers starting on soft for the race. Might have been Ocon. He took an engine penalty, didn't he? So that's probably why he started on softs. But anyway, the only reason Yuki was in Q3 was because during Q2, where everyone else was running the medium tyre, the slower tyre, Yuki was running the soft, so managed to get a better advantage, using those softer tyres to get through to Q3, which was primarily to give Gasly the toe down the main straight. Now, if you're familiar with the Mexican Grand Prix circuit, it has one of the longest straights on the calendar. Forgive me, I don't know how long it is, but it is one of the longest straights. I think it's almost as long as Baku's main straight with the kink at the very end of Baku. And so much time can be gained there by being in the slipstream. And, we're talking about a couple of attempts. And when we're thinking about qualifying, a couple of attempts goes a long way, especially with how close the midfield is this year. So Yuki doing the team a solid by qualifying on the softs in Q2 and getting through to Q3. So Yuki helped Gasly get the slipstream down the main straight and then followed him. So then Gasly overtook him going into turn 1, which is executed perfectly if you've watched the onboard, which I've searched for to make sure I know what I'm talking about. So for the rest of the sectors, Yuki was just following Gasly through sector 1, 2, and 3 because this wasn't his main qualifying run. He was in a box and come out again on fresh or just go for a second run once Gasly has done his. Yuki's engineer came onto the radio and let him know that Perez was on a fast lap about 4 seconds behind him. And then 4 seconds behind Perez, there was Max also on a fast lap. So the Red Bulls were behind them doing their final qualifying runs. And it's important to remember that this is happening with a minute left in the session. So both these drivers have gone late. It's the last chance to get these times. It's all or nothing. Turned out to be nothing. So Yuki, with the instruction of his engineer, was asked to move out the way. Now, maybe that might mean moving to the other side of the track or moving off the racing line. But because we're going through these S sectors, which are very similar to the USA, Maggots and Beckett's in Britain, Yuki decided to go off the racing track, the opposite side to the racing line. So completely out of the way of any cars coming behind him. So Perez turned up and saw that Yuki was off the track and seemed to slightly lose control of his car. He had a snap and it all kind of went wrong for Perez. Now, whether this was Perez overdriving the car or just whether it was just a driver mistake and which caused him to have that snap or make him lose a little bit of control, we don't know. But Perez also went off the track on the left-hand side with Yuki as well, narrowly avoiding Yuki, if I don't say so myself. Like it was quite close. We're within a meter or two. And obviously then Max came through, saw 2 cars off the track, and it's unclear whether Max slowed down because he saw 2 cars off the track potentially rejoining where he wanted to drive, or whether there was a yellow flag because there was 2 cars off the track. We don't know. But Max's lap was also was ruined. There was a distraction, nevertheless. This is what's really important to remember. It's without a doubt, Yuki did exactly what he was asked to do. He came off the track and made sure that he didn't get in the way of those 2 Red Bull cars. I don't know whether Perez made a mistake or whether he was distracted. It's just one of those things. And then Max also got distracted and came off the accelerator and had a slightly slower lap than he wanted. But it was just the outcome. It was just the response to this incident which didn't really sit well with me. Now, Alex, what do you think about the incident itself? And then we'll talk about the Christian Horner Red Bull PR aftermath kind of disaster, which you so love because it's happened in Silverstone and now it's happened again.
I seem to recall that Tsunoda, that's who I'm trying to remember, Tsunoda, when he left the track, maybe kicked up some dust. That may have distracted Perez or whatever, but certainly it seemed that, Tsunoda did what he was asked to do, gave the tow, and then moved as far out. Like, where else could he have go to get more out of the way? Like, he literally left the track, so he did what he was asked to. And then, the follow-up from that seemed to be that it was Yuki's fault. Christian Horner described it as we've been Tsunoda'd. And although that is quite a vague thing to say, it's easy enough to interpret that as him saying that it's Tsunoda's fault, which seems pretty unfair for the poor rookie driver. He's had a tough enough season as it is. I mean, there's no excusing the poor performances that he has put in throughout most of the season so far, but blame him for what he has done wrong rather than, just piling on for the sake of it. And it just seemed a little unceremonious, and it doesn't really shine a particularly positive light on Red Bull, and that's the way that they treat their drivers. It didn't seem like we need to look at it, we need to make sure what's happened. It was just straight up throwing him under the bus a little bit. But Tsunoda seemed to be positive nonetheless after the race. It seems like he's been working on his mentality towards his racing. So he didn't seem particularly fazed by it overall, which was good to see. There was a video of him packing up after the race because obviously he DNF'd very early on. He seemed to be in reasonable spirits, and hopefully it doesn't go too hard on him. But just a little bit, much like it was the British Grand Prix that you mentioned, is just the response to it is just bad PR, if nothing else.
Yeah.
It's not a good look for the team. Yeah, I don't really know quite why that was such a knee-jerk reaction for poor Yuki there, but that's the way it goes sometimes, especially when you're driving for a team that is clearly a subordinate team to the big one.
Not a sister team.
They like to say they like to say that they're still up there, and Pierre Gasly was certainly proving that at the Grand Prix on Sunday. But clearly there is a certain master and subordinate relationship going on there.
It's such a shame that he went out of his way to help his team play the team game to get Gasly into P5, I think he qualified, which is great for the AlphaTauri. And Gasly had a fantastic weekend. That reminds me, I don't have my driver of the day prep. This is going to be interesting later on in the podcast. But Gasly had a great weekend because of the position he got into in qualifying. And that was helped by his teammate. And that seems to be forgotten. And you've got one half of this is social media in a whole. You've got one half of the social media saying that he's done this incredibly dangerous, wrong thing and he's jeopardized 3 people's laps. And you've got the other half going, well, actually, he's just done what he's been told. And I'm in that camp. He was just done what he's told. And I don't think he could have executed it any better. If he had stayed on track, it would have been even worse. He would have been slandered even more. But the guy can't seem to catch a break at the moment. And he's had a bad season. There's no doubt about it. But he was playing the team game, and he's been heavily criticised about it. And it's just not very nice.
Furthermore, the times that the Red Bulls were on already indicated that they weren't likely to do much better than they had done, or it didn't suggest that they were going to be much faster in order to gain P1 or P2. And Verstappen ended up nearly 4 tenths behind Bottas, so the difference was pretty significant. Whether or not had Tsunoda not done that, they might have ended up further up the grid. It's hard to say exactly, but it's the data at the time suggests that it wouldn't have made a huge difference. So that was qualifying.
Well, that's it. Yeah, that was qualifying. Over to you, Alex.
One thing that was interesting as well coming out of qualifying, because obviously the setup for the grid was slightly mixed up at the back because of people taking engine penalties, is that we ended up with the 2 Haas drivers starting in like the best positions they'd ever started in.
Oh, of course, yeah.
For their position. So it meant that one thing, it seems a little strange at the time, but I was kind of looking forward to actually seeing maybe the Haas drivers getting a chance to do some racing and actually fight for positions, because usually they start right at the back, the race begins, and that's it, everyone else is off. And then they've got some blue flags to look forward to in 15 laps time or so. But they actually got to do some racing.
It was quite quick, wasn't it? Those blue flags came through quite quick.
A lap or 2. The next big thing really is just before the action at turn 1, we did have that very slow procession towards the lineup on the grid.
Yes,
where we had another one of those entertaining FIA radios from Mercedes who were complaining about how slow everyone was being. They do have to line up after a certain amount of time, don't they? They get a certain amount of time from the point at which the person in P1 reaches their box, and that's they have to get into position within a reasonable amount of time. Don't exactly know what that is, but it was amusing to see a little bit of slowing down. I don't really know why everyone was being so slow to get into position, or if there was some advantage to that. But because it wasn't coming from people fighting for the top, it was people just generally being slow. So that was a bit unusual. And then we obviously got the big straight, and much like Sochi, you have this bizarre situation where starting in P1 is a disadvantage, and that there's the curse, if you like, about starting on pole at Mexico and not actually winning the race. So you had this rather unusual scenario. We expected to see a big slipstream, and we got a bit of drama going into turn 1 because first you had Max Verstappen brilliantly going so late on the brakes to just ease it round into the lead on the outside. He made it look very easy. He seemed to brake good 50 meters later than everybody else. Absolutely fantastic move to take the lead. It was pretty much all over after that. I mean, he just led for the rest of the race, apart from when Perez led for a little bit, obviously, after Max had boxed. But otherwise, it was Max's race from that point onwards. So that was job done. But we also had Daniel Ricciardo going in a little bit too deep, having a bit of a lock up, coming in quite shallow to what is essentially a 90-degree corner, and tapping poor pole sitter Valtteri Bottas, who ended up in a spin. Ricciardo lost his wing. This is a pretty slam dunk Ricciardo's fault, this one. And I'm kind of surprised that the stewards decided no investigation was necessary, because we've had situations where people have got, even though it's lap one, people have got penalties for that. And there's no denying that Ricciardo did ruin Bottas's race completely, as well as his own. But nonetheless, that doesn't really make up for it.
No, it was a strange one. It was almost inevitable, because before the race started, and it was one of these weekends, it was one of these rare weekends where we could sit down and watch the race together through the power of Discord. And we said it's going to be 4 wide into turn 1, because you just know the people who qualify in first and second are at a disadvantage because they're not getting anyone's toe. And whereas Bottas and Hamilton got an equally good start each, none of them ended up in front of another one to give the Mercedes an advantage. So the 2 Red Bull chaps behind them managed to get so much of a slipstream. You just saw what happened. And Daniel Ricciardo managed to tuck in as well and was right alongside the Red Bulls going into turn 1. Obviously outbroke himself. And like you said with Max Verstappen, the amount of confidence he had going into turn 1 with a car which had been sat on the grid for about 45 seconds. So his brakes would have been, the brakes wouldn't have been up to temperature. His tyres would have been cold. But somehow, he, like you said, he broke 50 meters later than the 2 Mercedes and anyone else on the grid, and kept it on the grey stuff, kept it on the track. It's not like he went wide or cut the grass like we've seen Hamilton do a couple of years ago, where he went straight on. Just kept it on the track, went round everyone, and that was it. That was Max done for the whole race, and I'm sure we'll talk about his performance later on. But yeah, Ricciardo's slightly disappointing. I was very excited to see him in the position he was for the half a kilometre or kilometre straight we had. It looked like he was just about to tuck into P4 or maybe P3. But like you said, went into that corner really shallow and just wouldn't have had the room or didn't have the racing line at all to make the move he was trying to do, and just ever so slightly tapped Bottas, which knocked off his whole wing and jeopardised both their races.
Yeah, I thought that Bottas and Hamilton as well, you were talking about the lack of slipstream for the 2 of them. They presumably will have had some kind of understanding of where they were going to try and position themselves at the beginning, because Bottas was positioned in such a way as to protect Hamilton, it looked like.
Yeah.
So I did see a few accusations that Bottas should have done more to stop Verstappen, but I think if he moves further to the left, then that's giving space to go between the 2 Mercedes. Yeah. So I actually think that they did pretty much everything they could to try and block off that slipstream. But Verstappen was very smart and had the confidence to stop the car enough to keep it on the track. And we didn't really see at all what I expected to see, which was 1 or 2 cars just blow over the grass.
No,
Fernando Alonso seeing if he can play the rules again or something. No, we didn't see anything like that. But what we did see was the contact between Bottas and Ricciardo, of course, but we also saw a tangle. It was Ocon, Tsunoda,
and
Schumacher. They all sort of got into a bit of tangle. Ocon suffered some damage, but he was able to continue. And
Ocon was in the middle, wasn't he?
Yeah, he got completely sandwiched. Nothing he could do about it. It was just a real mess. And Schumacher and Tsunoda just unlucky, really. Just got caught up in it. It was unfortunate, really, for Tsunoda, who might have felt like he was in a position to try and redeem himself, because actually his actual qualifying position ended up being P17, but it was clear from Gasly's performance that there was a lot of potential speed in that car to be had, and unfortunately we didn't get to see Yuki use any of it. So that was a bit of a mess going into turn 1, and we ended up with did we have a safety car? I'm trying to remember if we had a safety car.
Yep, we had a safety car.
We did, didn't we? Yeah.
Yeah, we did, because Tsunoda's car was on the inside of turn 2.
It was right on the apex, wasn't it?
It was kind of beached on the apex. Yeah, he couldn't do anything about it.
So we ended up with a safety car, a few people boxed to sort their cars out and the like, and then we were on our way. So anything else you want to cover about turn 1, or shall we move on?
I'm happy to move on, and whilst we're on the topic of Bottas, it'd be rude not to continue that conversation. I know it becomes a bit of a tradition, us talking about Bottas on this podcast. Like many other things. And it'd be rude, again, not to talk about Bottas and carry on that tradition. So I've got a couple of points here I'd like to bring up, and then we can go into a deeper discussion if you want. But here's some highlights or lowlights of Bottas's weekend. We've got qualifiers on pole position. Absolutely fantastic. Never thought in a million years that Mercedes would be on pole. It wasn't out of the question, but this was definitely a Red Bull circuit. They looked very strong in practice, and they looked very strong in Q1 and Q2, and Mercedes put it on pole. Whether that was because Red Bull had that incident in Q3 and couldn't complete a lap, we'll never know. But Mercedes put it on pole, and Bottas put it on pole. More importantly, Bottas is back. Bottas 7.4. Gets spun on lap 1. Not great. And then he gets stuck behind the same guy who spun him for the whole entire race. He was stuck behind Ricciardo for the whole race. Guess you've got two Mercedes engines in both those cars. Didn't see many overtakes this weekend. It's just the nature of the altitude of the track and the cars itself. But stuck behind the guy who basically took you out of the race, that must have been pretty demoralizing. He has an 11-second pit stop. Instant flashbacks to Monaco. It was the same situation, but luckily they managed to rectify it. Embarrassing nevertheless. There was quite a few pit stops this weekend, and I know you're quite hot on your pit stops, but how each team does. And a couple of the teams did really well, but there was a fair few teams who didn't execute their pit stops well at all. He pits again for fastest lap, only to get held up by Verstappen. So Verstappen actually lost 3 seconds when Bottas was behind Verstappen going for fastest lap. And over that lap, Verstappen lost 3 seconds in Sector 3 and accidentally held up Bottas for the fastest lap.
It was no accident.
So Bottas pits again. Yeah, it was no accident. We tried to remain mutual on this podcast, but no, it was no accident. The timing shinks don't lie. Bottas pits again for fastest lap. Gets the fastest lap, but doesn't get the point. Nature of the game, but managed to take away a point rather than gain a point. So he took away a point from Red Bull, which actually is the difference between Red Bull and Mercedes being tied in the constructors and Max leading by 20 points instead of 19 points. So worthwhile doing. But to finish it off, he was lapped twice and he finished 15th after starting in pole. So overall, not a brilliant weekend for Bottas. How would you describe his luck or his performance this weekend? I guess luck and performance is pretty hard to summarize in one sentence because they're completely two different things. And I would say he was very unlucky, but his performance up until the race was pretty good.
Yeah, it was definitely a surprise to see him on pole.
A good surprise.
Yeah, it was a pleasant surprise in that we got the unexpected, I suppose. But Bottas's performance was, like you've said, a mixture of bad luck and also struggling behind Ricciardo. And he was in some clear air at one point, but didn't seem to make any headway. And it wasn't really clear. He just didn't seem to be able to make any advances on Ricciardo at all. He never really got close enough to make a serious move done. And Ricciardo had damage as well, because he obviously had to replace his wing, but he had damage too, because at the end of the race, when Ricciardo was on the radio, his engineer said to him, we had some damage to this as well, so that's a good result considering the issue that you had. So I don't know whether Bottas had damage as well, but he just wasn't able to make any headway, and he ended up having to box for a fourth time in order to get that fastest lap in the end. Yeah, pit stop was terrible. When you compare it to Red Bull, who were absolutely you could set your watch to that pit crew. They are in this super high pressure situation. It's all about nailing the pit stop, and they did it each and every time. You can't fault them. Mercedes, we've kind of talked before. We definitely talked about this more last year, where we were saying their car is so dominant, they're so much faster than everyone else that they don't really need to put too much effort into their pit stops. That now might be coming back to haunt them if that's the case, because they really seem to be struggling. This is the second time, like you say, that they've really had a proper howler involving threading part of the nut to get the wheel off. And you saw these huge sparks and flames coming off it as they were trying to get it off. It was quite an impressive sight, really, although not for Bottas, who was completely helpless. I think the whole time ended up being like 11 seconds or something like that. And that just completely ruined it even more. So I do feel sorry for Bottas. He is pretty hard done by in this situation. Didn't really help himself by not being able to get past, but I don't know that's whether or not he might have had damage similar to Ricciardo as well. But it was It's a shame, but that's the way it goes. Really, I still don't really subscribe to the Bottas has been announced for Alfa, so now he's suddenly a lot better. I don't really still don't really subscribe to that.
No, and recent performances obviously justify that. It's not without saying that Bottas didn't look at some overtakes, because at the end of the main straight, he definitely looked a couple of times, and one or two times I thought he was close enough just to send it up the inside and really maybe not pass, but make Ricciardo go defensive or take a wider line. He obviously went into, after that second DRS straight, which I'm sure we should talk about that second DRS straight as well. It's not on my notes, but we will talk about that later on and how the DRS works at the Mexico Grand Prix. But after that second DRS straight, there's a left-hander, isn't there? And Bottas looked like he went for a move up the inside of Ricciardo, but actually looking back at the replay, I'm not sure if he had a snap of oversteer and like hit the pedal to correct it and looked like he was going for a move, or whether he actually went for a move. The car looked a little bit out of shape, but who knows? That is, I'd be lying if I said the Mercedes didn't look, out of shape this weekend, because actually compared to the Red Bull, the Mercedes was sliding all over the place. Wasn't the best car on the grid and hasn't been for a couple of races now. But yeah, what can you do? What can you say about Bottas? He's a lovely guy, put it on pole position. He's back, he's eating his porridge and then gets spun in turn one, and that's his whole race over. Whereas, and I don't want to compare him to other drivers, but we've seen Lewis in similar situations, admittedly in previous years where the car's been so much stronger and they've been able to cut through the grid, and Lewis has been able to cut through the grid and make headway and finish in the points. And that's exactly what Mercedes would have expected out of Bottas today. Terrible start, was at the back of the grid. They would have expected him to try and cut through the grid and score a couple of points at least, but he just really didn't have the pace at all. And we don't know whether that was through damage or not, but an underwhelming performance from Bottas from lap 2 onwards up to lap 1. It was pretty spot on from him.
Well, speaking of the trouble that Ricciardo had, it was a very one-sided battle in the battle for P3 in the Constructors in Mexico. I think McLaren were pretty fortunate and worked pretty hard to get that 1 point compared to Ferrari's 18. I think Ferrari managed to score. So it was I was kind of prepared for a pretty bad result, because the whole weekend was signifying pretty clearly that it was going to be a struggle and that Ferrari seemed to be looking quite good. Their package was not quite so affected by the conditions and the environment. So, we ended up with this very one-sided battle. Ricciardo put himself out of contention right at the start, of course. Norris actually had a really good race because he started from P18, I believe. And finished with a point. So gaining 8 places in a race where lots of people were struggling to even get close and overtake people, I thought that he did a really good job and it was executed nicely. That was about the most that they could hope for, really. But Ferrari, on the other hand, they were brilliant. Like, the Sainz has now had 11 consecutive points finishes, I believe. And Charles Leclerc, they couldn't get anywhere near Gasly. Charles Leclerc did have a little go at trying to close the gap, didn't really get anywhere, and they ended up swapping back by the end. So there was a nice little clearly a good relationship between the two drivers. They'd had an understanding about it beforehand and agreed to it as a result. But, both of them were pretty impressive, and they managed to bring home some great points for the team, and that secured them the P3 in the standings, as we'll look at them later. But there was no battle to be had when you compare it to the United States, when we actually saw some good on-track action. We got absolutely nothing like that here to Mexico, and I do feel that it might be quite difficult for McLaren to overturn that now, looking at recent form. I don't know if that's because they're putting more effort now into next year's car. Ferrari seem to be bringing more upgrades still. They've had quite a few engine improvements recently. So, I'm a bit concerned it's going to be difficult for McLaren to overturn that now, and it was absolutely advantage Ferrari after the Mexican Grand Prix.
There's a lot of speculation with regards to McLaren's performance, whether it was due to the altitude or not, and we've mentioned that already. That's one of the highest tracks on the calendar, and the air is so thin that actually the DRS doesn't work very well. The engines are working so much harder to bring in the air they need to work, and Obviously, the Mercedes struggled because they weren't as fast as the Red Bull, so therefore the McLaren's on a struggle as well. And the Ferrari, like you said, just seemed to have got it right this weekend. They have done at Mexican Grand Prix before; they've done well. Do you think that going to Brazil in a couple of days' time, also quite high up, that the altitude is going to affect them just as much, or are you I know you're hoping for a closer battle between McLaren and Ferrari, but realistically, where do you see both teams sitting going forward into the next race at a similar altitude?
Brazil, I'm not sure what the height difference actually is. I don't think it's quite as drastic as Mexico City.
It's the similar height to. It's not as high, but it's the second most close. It's as close to Mexico as any other track.
Okay, well, it's a very, very different track. It's a very short track as before, but the profile of it is very different. There's a lot more elevation changes and the like. It's hard to say exactly how that will affect the cars. Like I said, I still think that there's a reasonable belief that Ferrari have got the advantage now, and they tend to do quite well on tracks that have a lot of sort of slower corners and tend to be a bit more twisty. It's just something to do with their aero and the nature of the McLaren car by comparison. I'd like to think that when you look at a performance like Sainz in 2019, for example, where he went from the back of the grid to P3, there must be something within that, because I don't think the car concept has changed that much since then. I think that there's a chance that there's still some good performance to be found there, and they're not going to struggle in quite the same way that they did in Mexico. At least I certainly hope not. And Norris has taken an engine penalty. He's got new components that he's dealing with as well. So I don't think it'll be quite as drastic. The altitude difference probably makes the biggest difference on that long straight because the DRS is not as effective. And like you said, the engines have to work that much harder. And the turbos as well. Then, you've got to bring in a lot of air, but the actual air that you're bringing in is quite thin. Then in order for it to have the same effect, you obviously have to bring in that much more air. And you saw the cooling, for example, that they had on the back of the cars, these much wider cooling units compared to other tracks on the calendar. So it clearly makes a big difference. Whereas in Brazil, we're not likely to see something like that because it doesn't have this massive, great big straight that basically constitutes nearly a third of the track.
No, exactly.
So I hopefully won't be quite as drastic.
And hopefully the sprint qualifying next week won't play into the hands of one team or the other, because it's a shame that I kind of want a traditional qualifying session at Brazil because it's such a technical track and it's short and it's a good mix. It's always close at Brazil, but we've got qualifying and then a sprint race, and it's called a sprint race. It's not called sprint qualifying. The FIA finally confirmed that it's a sprint race.
Are they not calling it sprint qualifying anymore?
Sprint race now all over the website.
Right, okay.
And then obviously the results of the sprint race is the position for the actual race, the Sunday race, the main event. Who knows? But obviously tune in next week for our post-race debrief on the Brazilian Grand Prix, or as it is probably going to be called, the Brazil Grand Prix. Who knows? Yeah. I'm sure we'll let you know next week.
I demand consistency.
Yeah, and that's what we haven't got at the moment.
It's not the Britain Grand Prix, is it? It's the British Grand Prix.
Absolutely, yeah. It's not the Australia Grand Prix, is it? Or not that we've got one. It just doesn't make sense. What are you doing to us?
We had the United States Grand Prix. Why is it not the American Grand Prix?
I have no idea. And they purposely, because it was the US GP, it wasn't the USA GP, the hashtag, or it wasn't the American GP, it was just US GP. And I was like, okay, whatever. It is what it is. We'll tweet something else. But like you said, back to Ferrari and McLaren. This week hurt a lot, didn't it? Like, we always knew it wasn't going to be in McLaren's hands this week, especially with the grid penalties going into the weekend. And Ferrari capitalized well, and we're finishing 5th and 6th, whereas Norris did very well to get that 1 point. And who knows where Ricciardo could have finished if he didn't lock up into turn 1. But there's no point dwelling in the past. Hopefully Brazil will be a much better track for McLaren, and that fight will continue. It'd nice to see it close up a little bit before the end of the year.
Right, where are we going next?
We are going on to a returning subject, just like the McLaren and Ferrari battle. We're going to talk about the battle of the teammates, and it's always been important throughout the season, but it just gets so much more important as we get closer to the end. We've mentioned it on the podcast before, and I can probably continue to mention it until the championship has been decided in 4 races' time. As it stands, Bottas is on 185 points and Perez is on 165 points. 20 points between them. Interestingly, there's only 19 points between Max and Lewis, so both parts of the team are in real fights for P1 and P3, respectively, and how both these fights are going to impact the championship. And there's obviously only 1 point separating Red Bull from Mercedes, so now more than ever do both drivers in the team need to make sure that they perform. Obviously, we've spoken about Bottas this weekend and how he was unlucky, but maybe cutting through the grid would have done him and the team some favours because that gap has closed. It was 40 points a couple of weeks ago back at the United States, or I can't remember where we went before then, but a couple of weeks ago it was 40 points, and here we are, 1 point separating the Constructors' Championship. And I can't remember for the life of me the last time Mercedes have even been close, or where a team has ever been close to this Mercedes, where a team has been this close to Mercedes, should I say. Sorry about that. But it's interesting to see. Like, I never thought going into this year Perez and Bottas would have such an impact on this championship, and they are. It's literally in their hands now. Max and Lewis are finishing P1 and P2, and that's absolutely fine. They can fight till the very end. Switching places, I don't mind, but Bottas and Perez, so much pressure because the Constructors' Championship is going to go down to them. Like, Max and Lewis can't do any more. First and second is pretty good, but Perez and Bottas, wow, like, the pressure is on. And at the moment, Perez is doing a good job finishing P3. Was this his second consecutive podium?
It's his third.
This year. His third. There we go. So he's doing everything he possibly can, and Bottas is just slowly, just isn't doing enough. Alex, talk us through it. I'm tripping over my words here. I'm just so excited about this battle, but talk us through the battle of the teammates, or the battle of the wingmen, as I think you've called it before.
I just remembered that one of my bold predictions for this season was that Bottas would finish behind both Red Bull drivers. So getting closer
it's not
to
out of the
one
question.
Of those.
Yeah, I mean, if Lewis can overcome the 19-point deficit to Max to win the championship, Perez can overturn, the 20-point deficit to Bottas and take P3. It's not out of the question.
Yeah, I hadn't actually really thought as much about the Battle of the Wingmen, but now you mention it, it is a big deal here because, like you say, Bottas didn't score, and Perez ended up on the podium, so it was a big one. And Perez, in case it weren't clear enough already, has absolutely.
Did he win the championship?
It did seem that way, didn't it?
Does it look like it?
After he finished the race, but. He's absolutely vindicated in the decision to put him in that seat. He's obviously done really well. He seems to have found a bit more of a rhythm, like you say, third podium in a row. Much more of what we expect from him, which is good. Actually acting as a solid teammate for Max Verstappen. That was abundantly clear in the post-race celebrations. There's obviously a very good feeling around the team between the two of them. I thought that Perez's response after the race was very touching. He's like, I'm so happy that we've won in my country. And it was a huge party atmosphere. It was absolutely fantastic. Some 370,000 odd fans at
crazy.
The stadium. Absolutely incredible. And the fact that he wasn't able to get past Hamilton in the end didn't seem to dampen their spirits at all. They were still absolutely well up for it, both the fans and the team, and Perez himself. So, yeah, it was really good for Perez. I think that both of us were a little bit confused by the decision in Red Bull not to pit him earlier. They seem to leave him out a very long time, and both of us are going, why is Perez not pitted? Like, I don't understand why they seem to think they might have a bigger tyre advantage. And it did seem that they had an advantage later on, but it wasn't enough to get the move done. And Perez didn't really seem to get it into a sort of dangerous enough point. It didn't feel like he was ever really harassing Hamilton. He was close enough to be in DRS range, but that alone was not enough to cause enough of a threat. And then there was a point where he dropped back, and then he pulled in again, and then he dropped back again, and then he pulled in. Like, I've got it in my notes here about all the times where he keeps closing in, and now Perez is going back again, and lap 28. Now Perez is closing in again, and lap 33. Why hasn't Perez boxed? Hamilton is simply just closing the pit gap now that he's got fresher tyres. And it was some 7 or 8 laps later that Perez actually did pit. Fantastic stop from Red Bull crew. Then lap 46, I've got a note here that says that AWS reckons that it's 13 laps to Perez overtake. not only do they know how many, or they reckon they know how many laps it's going to be, there's also like a percentage chance of overtake as well. I don't understand it. They're making it up as they go along, as far as I'm concerned. But it didn't happen in the end. Nonetheless, it was still a good result. And the Battle of the Wingmen is in a funny old place again. So, but you'd be fools to discount Mercedes. So I think that there's still going to be plenty of excitement. I hope that Red Bull don't just walk away with it now. I hope that Verstappen doesn't walk away with it, because this championship has been so close for so long. Give me that right down to the wire.
Shame.
You know, give me that. Give me that Hamilton in 2008 winning the World Championship on like the final corner. Give me that moment. I want something like that. That would be great. That'll really be the cherry on top of a magnificent championship. So, fingers crossed.
It absolutely would, and fingers crossed, because the Constructors' Championship looks like it's going to go down to the wire, because it's just so close, and 19 and 20 points between P1 and P2 and P3 and P4. That is spicy in itself. This is incredible stuff, and like you said, it's been a spectacular season, and to have the final go down to Dubai, a newly laid out track as well. So no driver's actually driven this layout before. Fresh track, fresh tarmac, brand new experience. They always throw up a good atmosphere as well. If it can go down to that race, wow, we're in for a treat. We really, really are. Imagine if Max has to finish. Like if Lewis has to finish first and Max has to finish P3, and it comes down to Bottas. This mind blown. Can you imagine oh man. There's no point talking about it now, but that's the reality of the situation. It could be down to Bottas or Perez who decides the championship. If Lewis is in the right place, being on the back foot now, he probably has to win the next couple of races. And it's only Bottas in between Lewis and Max. That could be the deciding factor. Bottas's defending could be the deciding factor on this championship. We are in for a treat. Congratulations, Max. But that's it. That's all I've got from the Battle of the Wingmen. It's spicy. We'll talk about it next week as well after Brazil. I'm sure we will. But it's getting tense.
I've got one more talking point, which is I want to talk about poor Giovinazzi, who he didn't really have a good weekend overall. It started off well because he qualified P14, which wasn't especially amazing, but he was only a few tenths behind his teammate. But because of all the penalties, he ended up starting P11. So it's not a bad start. He was P11, Raikkonen was P10. So it was a good starting position for Alfa Romeo, who kind of need every point they can get if they want to stand any chance of catching up Williams. And Antonio had a fantastic start. He did really well at the beginning. He was fighting his way up. I think he got up to like nearly P6, P7 at one point when he was fighting at the beginning. And the Alfa Romeo in January looked pretty strong. Maybe that's some kind of connection with Ferrari, because obviously they have the same engine, and maybe there's something about the way that engine works in the altitude that benefited them as well. I'm not sure. I don't know if they have any kind of relationship with Ferrari in regards to other parts. I don't know if they use the same gearboxes or anything like that. I don't quite know. By all means, let us know if you do know the answer to that. Nonetheless, they looked pretty strong overall, all things considered. And Giovinazzi was running, I think, P7 for quite some time and had Vettel and a few others behind him. He definitely had a good start. But then the team decided to pit him for reasons that weren't exactly clear. And it gave him no advantage. It didn't protect him from the undercut. And the multitude of cars that were behind him and were basically stuck behind him were now ahead of him. And then he was just stuck there and was just, victim who just had a bit of a blue flag race for the rest of it and ended up finishing P11 again. Because I'm pretty sure he's had quite a few P11s this season. I did have it up here, looking at his racing record, and he's just had a pretty unlucky season in quite a few ways. He's also had his own struggles, but then after the race, he was really unhappy. On the radio, he sort of sarcastically said, "Thanks for the great strategy, guys," because he just had his whole race ruined. I'm just looking at his race results here. Yeah, he's the last 3 races he's finished P11.
That's really good, but also so close to the points.
It's not quite close enough, is it? And in
Yeah.
his interview, he was quite scathing of the team in general. He basically said that the team had ruined his race. He didn't think there was going to be a time when the team could sort of deliberately ruin him, and it's happened. And that, to me, seems to suggest that perhaps it is over for Giovinazzi and that he won't be in that seat next year, because it seemed so definitive. I don't know. He seemed quite downcast. He seemed quite defeated. With the season coming to a close, it didn't seem like these were the actions of a guy who was thinking, "Oh, I've got very close and so far, and it's frustrating, but there's always next year." Didn't get that impression at all.
Yeah.
So, the in terms of speculation, which is what it is, I am leaning towards perhaps this is Giovinazzi's final season in F1.
Yeah, I don't have much else to add apart from Alfa Romeo, like you said, did look initially quite positive this weekend because of the links with Ferrari. I think Raikkonen scored a point, did he not? I think
He
Raikkonen
scored 4 points, I believe, because he
Scored 4
finished
points.
P8.
So the car was there. Raikkonen is obviously a great driver, but Giovinazzi has also put in some stellar performances as well. Like you said, he's finished P10 once and finished P11 4 times. P12 he's finished a handful of times as well. So that car is so close. It's teetering on the edge of points, just like the Williams has been for parts of the season. Interestingly, though, Williams has seemed to have dropped off a little bit towards the second half of the season, whereas Alfa Romeo seems
They were terrible. They were terrible in this race.
Yeah. I don't want to.
Russell finished behind Bottas, who had 4 pit stops.
That is a terrible statistic, isn't it? That is a real terrible statistic.
They were terrible. They just had no pace at all. So it was not a good one for Williams.
For Bottas to get his fastest lap, he actually let Russell overtake him, unlap himself, and then he followed Russell down the pit straight, obviously having DRS in the slipstream. So I thought that was a quite a strategic move. But I guess if you're sat in P15, you have a lot to think about because you're not really racing for anything. But back to Alfa Romeo. Close, but no cigar. And yeah, I think this is the end of Antonio. I don't think he'll be in Formula One next year. Like you said, he doesn't give the impression that he's not singing the corporate line at the moment, saying, "Oh, we could have done better, but we'll live and learn. We'll come back stronger to the next race," or anything like that. It was quite heartfelt. He was a bit upset, and no mentions of coming back stronger because I don't think he'll be coming back. Which is unfortunate, but that is Formula One. It's a harsh sport. Lots of drivers who want to come into the sport, so someone's got to leave. And look, he might as well be Antonio, the most underrepresented or the most absent driver this whole year. Bearing in mind he's had some good performances, he just really hasn't had any kind of special performances at all. Nothing standing out. When I say Antonio Giovinazzi to you, what do you think of?
Well, we have talked before.
Nothing.
We have talked before about, like you say, he just seems to be completely absent. So, and he's not necessarily had the machinery to show anything particularly special. And he does have Kimi Räikkönen as a teammate who is maybe not quite as feisty as he once was, but is still knows what he's doing, still knows how to get a performance out of the car. So, not been an easy one for Antonio. And I think, he might have lost his chance to really show that he can bring something.
It's a shame
special.
because
he did have some good qualifying results.
Yeah,
but,
and it's a shame because
never really converted it.
When likes of George Russell finishes in P11, everyone's like, "Oh, he's so close to the points. He's a brilliant driver. Look where he's dragging that car to. He'll get points without a doubt because he's a fantastic driver." Antonio gets
British
P11 on
talking about
that British bias, but Antonio gets P11 on 3 consecutive races, and everyone's like, "Oh." I had no idea. Admittedly, myself, I had no idea he finished P11 3 times. That shocks me. But that's how absent he is amongst the field. And well, that will probably be it. That will probably be it for him.
That's the end for Italian Jesus. So now we move on to our view from the stands. We got quite a few good questions this week, and we're going to start off with a message via Twitter from @ChrisDavis55, who asks, if you were a team principal, what creative ways can you think of to get around the salary cap next year? Thinking of making some flexi rule bingo cards. Great race yesterday on the whole. Just a shame the coverage didn't focus on the really close battles in midfield. There there was some battles being missed. And I think we talked about how they would have a moment where there was not a whole lot going on, but then you'd have an actual battle going on in the picture-in-picture mode that they have on the timings on the left-hand side. And I'm there thinking, this should be the other way round. We should be seeing the battle in the main screen. But going back to the first,
you'd get the fan reactions.
Yeah.
How many times did the camera cut to the fans or the children or the pit stops or the pit crews? And we were thinking, hold on a sec, this car's actually overtaking each other here. Yeah. Why are we looking at people's faces?
Trying to watch a race. There was definitely one point where somebody was just about to, or looked like they were just about to overtake someone. And the shot pans to these like kids on the, what are you doing? I'm trying to watch a race here. I don't want to see two random children in the stand. Like, but anyway, going back to the first part of Chris's question about what he says about a salary cap next year. I don't think there is a salary cap. I think the cap is a performance-based cap. They were talking about having a salary cap, but I don't think that's part of it anymore. I think that it's just like a flat $145 million for performance-based expenses. So stuff that's spent on the car and various other. It's obviously quite naturally it's Formula One, so it's quite complicated. All the specific things they have to do. But I don't think a salary cap is part of it. They talked about it, but it doesn't seem to have. I couldn't find anything that actually suggests that's going to be part of it. So I think that they've scrapped that idea. Whether or not there's any means of getting around the performance cap, I don't really know. But I don't think. Happy to be corrected on this, but I don't think there is a salary cap. And I don't think there was going to be one. I think there was a bit of a backlash. And I don't really think it's a good idea either.
I think the teams can hire and spend however much they want on personnel, on wages, and employing people. That's not capped at all. I think I think it's called the cost cap, isn't it? We keep on referring to the cost cap next year, which is basically development. It's how much the car's going to cost, how much development you can put into it, how much research you can put into it. But it's not a cap on personnel. So I think the advantage will be if you're Mercedes, Red Bull, Ferrari, and you've got hundreds of millions of pounds like as disposable money, which you can use to invest in critical people within the team. That's where the advantages are going to come from. If you can find yourself an Adrian Newey and buy 10 of them or hire 10 of them and use them and use their time and focus to, through salary to design and build a fantastic car. And then obviously the cost cap comes on from actually building the car and developing the engine and replacing engine parts, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the massive advantage will be for the teams who have all this disposable money outside of this $145 million or pounds of cost cap. They can hire as many people as they want and get all the big brains in the right places and to design these brand new cars. Whereas if you're Haas and you don't have this, don't have that huge amounts of disposable income or any disposable income. I know they've got some new investors, etc. And Mazepin's family is heavily invested in, but they're not going to have the 1,000, 2,000 strong force of people working with them. They're going to have a couple of hundred people max, very similar to Williams. And I'm sure, Aston Martin's probably in the middle somewhere, but Alfa Romeo won't have hundreds and hundreds of people. They'll have, they won't have thousands of people. They'll only have a couple of hundred. And that's where I think teams will try and reap the benefits of this cost cap. Obviously, the cost cap being focused on the car itself, but they can employ as many people as they want and pay them whatever they want to get that advantage.
And it obviously comes in conjunction with a sort of handicap system to do with wind tunnel time as well, based on where they finish. And so it means that Haas will get more time in the wind tunnel.
Haas will have a couple of years in the wind tunnel.
Yeah.
Mercedes or Red Bull will have a day or two.
Whether or not it'll help them at all, I don't really know, but that's part of it as well. So yeah, as far as I'm aware, there isn't a salary cap, I don't think, but there is definitely a cap on development costs on the car, and I'm sure you can find more detail about that. So, but thanks very much, Chris, for getting in touch. Who's next?
Our next tweet is from regular contactee Riley Gale 33. Thank you very much for getting in contact again. And Riley has said, surely now Max and Red Bull can think about the title with only 4 races to go, and how must Lewis change his attitude to get back in it? It's interesting you ask this because I think the question was asked to Max and to Christian Horner at the end of the Grand Prix, and both of them gave a very strong, politically correct, toe in the correct, corporate line. We're not focused on the title. We're taking it race by race. Still a long way to go. But you're right, Riley. In reality, there's not a long way to go, is there? We've had 20 19 races this year. I think we've got 4 left, puts us up to 23. I can't remember how many races we've got left, but we're coming to the end of the season, and there's only a handful of points left now. Like less than 100 points per driver can be awarded, and Max has a 20-point lead. So it's getting close. I think no matter what Max and Red Bull say about not thinking about the title and keeping it out of their head and focusing on each race weekend, I think they'll definitely be doing the maths in the back of the head, wondering if Max can finish P2 for the next 4 races or P3 for the next 4 races, what he has to do to secure that title. But they won't admit that, because it's all mind games at the end of the day. They've got to appear to be strong and well-minded going into the next couple of races. But without a doubt, I'm sure they're thinking about it, that they just don't want to tell anyone.
Also, I would have thought the mentality on the part of the driver and those around him would genuinely be looking at it as a just race by race, maximum performance each time. I can't imagine that Max individually is particularly focused on anything like that, because as we mentioned before, his whole attitude really has crystallized into one of maturity and having a positive attitude about that, and being very calm and being very cool about the whole thing. And so, I dare say that his attitude genuinely is to just focus on race by race. But like you say, there will be some behind the scenes and mathematics going on about, well, what do we need to do to actually win the title? The other part of Riley's questions about how must Lewis change his attitude to get back in it. I don't know if Lewis necessarily needs to or can change his attitude. He seems to have much the same attitude that he always has. He absolutely was giving it everything out there to keep it in front of Perez, which he succeeded in doing. He just didn't have the car there. It was just a pure machinery thing where he just seemed to be struggling in that regard. I think it probably comes down to whether or not Mercedes themselves can capitalize on the potential overhauling of any points at the future races. But Lewis himself, personally, I when he says he's given it his all, I believe him, because that's what the guy does. And I always say that you'd be a fool to discount the guy. So I think that there's still battles to come yet, and with only 4 races to go, it just gets more exciting. But advantage Red Bull is the appearance right now, so we'll see. But thanks very much for your questions.
Stand by.
And next we have Daniel Fergie 25, who got in touch. Again, thanks very much, Daniel. He asks, how do you think Vettel and Gasly did in the race since they finished P4 and P7 respectively? You mean they finished P7 and P4 respectively? But yeah, do you think they'll be happy with their overall performance, or will they be kicking themselves out of frustration? I can't imagine that Gasly will be kicking himself with frustration at finishing P4, because that's an incredible result and he was amazing. You didn't really see him the whole race. I don't think we saw him on the whole broadcast, but he was there.
I didn't see a glimpse of him.
He was definitely there. It was a bit lonely, which is what he said over the radio at the end, but he was just too fast. Ferrari couldn't even get anywhere near him. He put in a fantastic result. As for Vettel, again, I think similarly, he can only be really happy with that. I think that's the best. That's best of the rest in a general sense, isn't it? P7. So that's the most they could ask for. Vettel seemed pretty comfortable compared to his teammate at the very least. He was able to benefit from Alfa Romeo's strategic mistake to box Giovinazzi, who was holding him up for quite a considerable amount of time. He couldn't get past him. Vettel was on the radio going, yes, when Giovinazzi decided to pit. So that was good news for them. So I think both of them will be very, very, very happy with their overall performance. Both of them are pretty good driver of the day candidates, actually. So yeah, they're good shout out for the two of them. Anything you want to add about these two drivers?
Well, Gasly went from P5 to P4, which was great, and Vettel went from P9 to P7. So both drivers making up a position or two, kept it clean through turn 1, which was really important. Turned out to be, the end of a lot of people's races, or not technically the end, but ruined a lot of people's races.
Goodness knows Gasly's done that a few times.
Yes, exactly. So really good performance from both of them. Like you said, both contenders for driver of the day. And in my head, I'm trying to go through who I'm going to award driver of the day to, because actually there was a lot of good drives. Lando's up there as well. But Daniel, thank you very much for the tweet. We look forward to your tweets every single week, and we look forward to your tweet next week. Moving on to the final contactee of the day, and it's RPM legend Dave Doherty at David Doherty 8. And Dave has said, I love this place. It's magnificent. What do you think of the Mercedes qualifying session? Then having Red Bull to turn the tables on Mercedes in the race with a powerful strategy. Now, Alex and I talked about this off air after the race, and how maybe if Bottas was in the top 4, whether Mercedes could have, had out strategized Red Bull and their pace, and maybe got a Red Bull 1, but Mercedes 2 and 3. But it just wasn't the case because of the unfortunate events which happened at the start of the race. What did I think of Mercedes qualifying session? Unexpected, but I'm really glad that Bottas got what could be his final pole position in Formula 1. It was unexpected, but really glad for him. He put everything down on the table and he came out on top.
He got his Fangio cap, didn't he?
He got his Fangio cap, and also he beat his teammate as well. And his teammate is Lewis Hamilton, so to out-qualify Lewis Hamilton is a massive feat, and he should be very proud of it. Then to have Red Bull turn the tables, it was a shame, but I do think if it would have been a little bit closer if there was 4 cars in the top 4, 2 Mercedes and 2 Red Bulls, rather than 2 Red Bulls and 1 Mercedes. You can see over previous races how each team has the advantage if they've got 2 cars in the top 3 instead of just 1. But very interesting. Alex, what's your thoughts on that?
It's possible that their setups maybe they'd set up a particular way that meant that they were more favourable in the qualifying, whereas Red Bull had perhaps set up in a way that meant that they'd be more favourable in the race. Don't really know exactly, but it was a surprise to a lot of people to see Mercedes so far ahead. And what happened earlier with Yuki Tsunoda, like we said, didn't seem that actually had a massive impact on their likely finishing positions. So, it was a nice surprise. It was nice to have a slightly different start. And I agree that the magnificence of that final bit where the stadium section is very impressive. It really is a massive atmosphere. I'm not a huge fan of this track, though. I do think that you have that massive, great big straight, but because of the nature of the environment, the DRS actually isn't all that powerful, and sometimes it can be quite difficult to overtake despite that, how long that straight is, as we saw. And then as far as overtaking is concerned, very little happens for the rest of the lap. So it's and like that stadium section, it looks brilliant, but how many people have we really seen get past there? I can think of a time when Max Verstappen managed to slip through one time, but it's not a particularly prolific overtaking point. So I don't know, I'm not a huge fan of the track, but it does look great, and I can't fault the crowd because they were incredible. Like there seems like there's a little competition going on for best crowd, because we had we had the Dutch Grand Prix where it was really special. We had a very impressive crowd at the American Grand Prix. The British Grand Prix has always got a very excitable crowd with it as well, and obviously Hamilton took full advantage of that, as he is wont to do. So
the Italian Grand Prix as well.
Of course, Italian Grand Prix, slightly muted compared to previous years. It wasn't quite as impressive as it had been. Like, it wasn't 2019 levels of euphoria.
Jeez,
of course,
that was mad.
So it was a really impressive crowd, and certainly as a spectacle, it can't be faulted. Thanks very much, Dave.
And a car on the podium as well.
Yes, the car being lifted up to the podium is a impressive touch. I'm surprised that the US Grand Prix doesn't have something similar to that.
Watch this space.
I'm surprised that they haven't, aren't they going to get like a Chinook or something to pick it up and land it on the podium or something?
Yeah, I think the insurance
fire it out of an artillery
high.
piece. Why not?
Yeah. But thank you very much, Dave, for getting in contact. And if you're listening and want to get in contact with us next week or at any point during the week with regards to Formula 1, you can do by tweeting us at RacePerMinute, or you can email us at info@raceperminute.com. And you can also go on our website at raceperminute.com and send us an email through the contact form as well. All the details on the website or on our Twitter. So by all means, do get in touch. It's driver of the day and championship standings, and I've got a massive grin on my face because I think I know who I'm going to give driver of the day to. I'm going to go first this week because usually I pass the buck over to Alex, listen to his suggestions and pick from those. But I'm gonna be an adult and proper presenter this week and go for it myself. So we've got a couple of fantastic drives which we've mentioned throughout the podcast. Got Perez, who's done a fantastic job. There's a lot of hype around Perez this weekend. I mean, he's finished in P3, which is great. First Mexican on the podium, first Mexican to lead the race, first Mexican to lead his home race. So there's a lot of records that Perez has broken, and the crowd were, amazed with it. But if I just crowd aside, it was a good performance by Perez, but it was not driver of the day standard for me, despite the fact that he won driver of the day on the official vote. And Alex is shaking his head, so I'm sure he'll talk about how the fan vote is a bit more of a popularity contest rather than an actual driver of the day contest. But Sergio Perez won that with 36.9%, Max Verstappen with 13%, Gasly with 7%, Lewis Hamilton with 6%, and Lando Norris, who came from the back of the grid to 10th, only got 5% of the votes. So it just goes to show that if you saw everyone on their phones in the crowd, that's what they were doing, voting for Perez for driver of the day. But back to the drivers who I think need a nomination. Alex is grinning. If you're not watching on YouTube, he's grinning at my commentary. Gasly did a fantastic job. So did Leclerc and Sainz, because Ferrari really stepped it up in the last couple of weeks. Vettel gained a couple of positions. Norris and that's Raikkonen as well did a fantastic job. Everyone else kind of had a mediocre weekend. It's a shame for Russell, like we mentioned. The Williams was absolutely nowhere to be seen. Alex mentioned Russell finished behind Bottas, who pitted 4 times, and one of those pit stops was 11 seconds. So a lot of time was lost with the Williams cars this weekend. They really need to step it up going into the final 4 races. But my driver of the day, and I just need to figure out where he started, is Lando Norris, who started in P18 and fought his way through to P10, when actually there wasn't too many on-track overtakes this weekend. A lot of it happened in the pit stop, but Lando cut his way through the field, kept it clean, did more than his teammate. And bear in mind, he finished higher than his teammate, who started 15 places ahead of him. Absolutely flawless weekend from him. And that's sort of got the say in the matter. Just a great drive. He gained the most positions throughout the race, which is why I'm kind of pushing towards Norris. But actually, the car, which didn't look like it was going to perform very well this weekend, did end up performing quite well for Lando Norris.
Yeah, likewise, I also went for Lando Norris. I had to give it to the guy who made up so many places on such a difficult weekend for the team, and the car didn't really look like it was going to be attacking too much, and we saw so many people struggling to overtake, and Norris didn't seem to have that issue, so he really was giving it everything. I thought it was rather amusing when he had a radio call with his engineer. The engineer was telling him something like when he was being lapped, I think he was being told to stay close enough to them so he could get DRS. And yes. Lando was like, well, yeah, that's obvious. Like,
of course.
Why would I not do
something
that?
Like that?
So kind of one of those sort of strange radio calls telling them how to drive the car. I think I've got to give it to Lando for gaining those 8 places. Big shout out for Gasly, though. He didn't really have to fight for it much, other than actually just put in the pure pace. And he was almost completely absent from the broadcast, as we mentioned, but he scored an excellent P4. And I think Vettel as well, in a car that has really struggled in so many places. And yet here he seemed pretty comfortable and really executed a good race alongside his team to gain P7. So, but Lando Norris for me overall. I think that's a pretty impressive performance. So going over to the standings, I think this time let's start with the constructors' standings, because right at the top there, Mercedes, 478.5 points. Red Bull with 477.5 points. That 1 point between the two of them is extremely juicy, and it is the difference of the fastest lap, isn't it? They would have had exactly the same points if they'd managed to get that.
Well done, Bottas.
So Bottas managing to get it done in the end. He did have to take another pit stop in order to do it. I thought that was very clever from Max to deliberately slow down, knowing that he had the gap to just block Bottas. That was very clever. It didn't really work out for him in the end, but it did make for a very interesting spectacle. And then in P3, unfortunately, for me at least, Ferrari now 268.5 points to McLaren's 255. They finally managed to swing it by 13.5 points ahead now. So, and I'm not going to go for P5. I'm going to let you do that because there's something pretty exciting going on from P5 as well.
So for P5, we've got Alpine with 106 points, but also in P6, we've got AlphaTauri Honda with 106 points. I can't remember for the life of me, for the last time, we've had 2 teams on exactly the same amount of points going into the final couple of races.
Right at the start of the season?
You are correct. About 19 races ago, this all happened.
Technically correct. The best kind.
But also, imagine if we had Mercedes and Red Bull on the same amount of points, and we're talking about Alpine and AlphaTauri as well being on the same amount of points. This is crazy stuff. But the amount of money which goes to P5 rather than P6 is such a significant difference. We're talking like millions and millions of pounds. So both teams will be putting everything into making sure that they finish almost best of the rest of the midfield, because Ferrari and Mercedes are out of the question, but Alpine and AlphaTauri they're both in it, and they're fighting each other because Aston Martin is too far behind. Speaking of Aston Martin, they're at 68 points. Williams have failed to score points again, but still remain on 23 points. Alfa Romeo picking up a couple of points, are now on 11. And up the rear is Haas with 0 points. And hopefully they'll do better next year, because it's been a long year for them. They said at the start of the year they wouldn't be supporting the car or developing the car, and they've only got 4 races to do, and then they can all go home for Christmas. Or maybe they should all go back to the factory for Christmas and start working on next year's car, which is hopefully what they've been doing whilst not developing this year's car. It would be nice to see them compete like they did in their first season of Formula One. Alex, you want to take us through the top half of the 2021 driver standings?
Indeed, yeah. I was just going to tag on to the end of what you're saying there as well about Haas, is that they are going to want to get developing. And Mazepin got lapped 3 times.
Oh, geez.
At this race. and he was having a battle with someone at one point. I've got in my notes here, Mazepin in a battle with Ocon on lap 12. Nice to see a Haas actually fighting for track position. It didn't last very long, though.
Didn't last very long.
Okay, so moving on to our driver standings then. Right at the top here, Max Verstappen leading the championship with 312.5 points to Hamilton's 293.5. So that gap has opened up that little bit more now. There's still not a lot in it, though. There's still very, very little in
still
that.
Close.
So still very exciting. Bottas is just about holding on to P3 with 185 to Perez's 165, as we discussed earlier. Norris also just about holding on to P5 with 150 to Leclerc's 138. So there's another potential upset going on there. Norris is going to really want to try and hold on to that, of course. Leclerc's teammate Sainz follows close behind with 130.5. And Daniel Ricciardo, I've scrolled down too far. There we go. Daniel Ricciardo with 105 points in P8. And I was like, I don't think Russell's that far up the table. Ricciardo with 105 points. Hopefully he can nab a few more, put some pressure on that P3 in the constructors again. Gasly with 86. It feels like he should be so much higher, but he's not. Like, if you said who's had a better season, Ricciardo or Gasly, like, I know Ricciardo's won a race.
You'd say Gasly.
You'd instinctively think, like, well, Gasly's been like amazing this season.
Yeah.
But it's still not quite got into those triple figures yet for Gasly. And then in P10, Alonso with 60, who has also been pretty consistently point scoring now for Alpine, though I think that Alpine will struggle against AlphaTauri now. If Tsunoda can find just a little bit of form near the end of the season, because he only has 20 points, I feel like he should have a lot more. So if he can find a little bit more form, I think that Alpine will struggle to hold on to their position.
Well, we're going into tracks. We're going into 2 new tracks where no one's driven before, and one of them isn't even built yet. So, the advantage which drivers who've had before driving previous tracks in Formula One or in previous series is done to disappear. All these drivers are going to this track for the first time, brand new. They'll probably be the first drivers to race on the track. So any advantage between teammates being old and young is done to disappear. But back to the standings, we've got Ocon, who's with 46 points, Vettel, who's on 42 points, and Stroll, who is on 26 points. Interesting, the gap between Vettel and Stroll. A lot of people were doubting Vettel's abilities going into the season, and by no means has he had a fantastic season, but given the car he's driving that his teammate has scored just over half the amount of points of him, it's not really gone too bad. We've been talking about Tsunoda. He's got 20 points. Russell's on 16. That's interesting. We've got an AlphaTauri on 20 points. We've got a Williams on 16 points. That's pretty close. And this is where Yuki needs to step it up, because his teammate's got more than 4 times the amount of points he has, which is that's a huge ratio difference, which is probably the worst on the grid. Raikkonen with 10 points, Latifi with 7, Giovinazzi with the 1, and then for the final 3 we still have Schumacher, Kubica, and Mazepin. We mentioned during the race that at one point Nikita was in P12, and we were trying to do the quick maths whilst watching the broadcast, where Nikita has to finish to jump Kubica in the standings, and it was something like P14. But unfortunately, he dropped down and was lapped 3 times, so it wasn't to be the case. But that rounds up the 21 drivers we have had in the 2021 season.
Right, thanks very much for joining us for our post-race discussion. Do send us your thoughts or questions or comments about this race or any other races or race per minute in general, whatever. We're always happy. We're always up for a little chat. And you can get in touch with us at RacePerMinute, all one word, on Twitter, getting in touch at RacePerMinute.com, or you can comment below if you're watching this on YouTube. And if you enjoyed this episode, then do give us a rating or a like wherever it is you're listening or watching. And if you really like what we do, then please consider subscribing wherever it is you're getting Race Per Minute, whether it's on your podcast app, whether it's on YouTube, whatever it is. It really helps us out, and you'll get all the latest episodes coming straight into your inbox. And if you really want to support the show and help us keep the quality content coming, then you can receive some lovely rewards by donating as little as £1 a month at patreon.com/raceperminute. So, Shane, like you said, we've got 2 essentially brand new tracks to Formula One. I know Lost Isle isn't a brand new track. Obviously, it's Brazil next, but looking into the future, we've got 2 sort of unraced tracks for Formula One coming ahead, which is pretty exciting. And it's rather nice that is being preceded by an old favourite. It's kind of funny to think that they were talking about replacing Interlagos not so long ago. There seemed to be some rumblings about a new track coming. Fortunately, it didn't happen. It's good old Interlagos coming back. Fantastic track. Very glad to have it back. What are your thoughts going into this circuit? Because we didn't have it last year, did we?
No, we didn't. It was due to the pandemic. We couldn't travel to Brazil. It's an old favourite, like you said. The championships have been won and lost there in the past, and overtaking is possible. It's a technical circuit. It's a fast circuit. It's a short circuit. I'm just describing the circuit now, but we've had some great battles in the past, and I'm sure we're going to have an absolute, a huge battle between Max and Lewis going into the first corner and throughout the whole circuit itself. It's just, I'm excited. Every single track we go to this year, I'm excited because there's a possibility that the championship might swing in one favour or the other. I'm hoping just for the champ. I mean, I'm British. I would like Lewis to get his 8th world champion, but I would also love there to be a brand new world champion on the grid. I love racing and I want to see everyone do well. But I would love Lewis to do well in Brazil to close the gap to Max, just to make sure that it goes down to the final race and we can have a huge battle at Yas Marina. And also the weather at Brazil is also very interesting. It could be glorious sunshine, but it could also be torrential rain. Hopefully not too much rain that we don't get a race, but just enough to spice things up. It's going to be a good one. I can't wait. And it's only in 6 days. We're recording this on Monday, and of course we've got 2 races there. We've got the old sprint race, and then we've got qualifying, sprint race, and then the feature event or the feature race. I don't know what it's called anymore. But I'm sure the sprint race will be a glimpse into what the full race will give us. What's your thoughts on Brazil?
Well, of course, Max Verstappen was the last winner here in 2019 at Interlagos, so he's going to want to repeat that. I think that it seems like he's got a reasonable chance to do so. But yeah, it can throw up a few surprises, can the Brazilian Grand Prix, and I'm hoping for some mixed conditions. Let's have a few spanners put in the works, have the drivers really tested. But I'm looking forward to it. It's great track, great fans. Can't wait. And we hope that you'll join us for the post-race discussion and post-race podcast for that as well. So thanks very much for listening, and we hope to see you then.
We'll see you then.